Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk to you what is a literature review during a PhD or in graduate school. So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There are so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help you out. All right, so most people don't have a clue what a literature review is. And I'm just kind of thinking about where I was in terms of what I was thinking when I started my PhD or started graduate school. So I did a master's, and in that literature review, I kind of did an overview of a bunch of different literatures for the thing I was trying to investigate. During my PhD, I had to sort of dig deep into sort of building theory, and I didn't really know what that was. I was really uncertain about how to do all this kind of stuff, and frankly, I was wrong with a lot of stuff. And now that I've been sort of working with this a little bit longer, I'm not an expert in any sort of way. I'm learning about this kind of stuff, but these are just kind of like the patterns that I've seen with literature reviews over the time that I've been doing this for the last I don't know, it's 2019. So I've been doing this for, almost, probably about 15 years, I guess, in terms of figuring this kind of stuff out. All right. So the general gist of this is probably for somebody that is maybe in their, maybe it's their first year, second year of doing, maybe they're just starting to get into doing their thesis with a PhD. And this is hopefully going to give you kind of like a how-to guide or, one of these sort of literature review for dummies kind of ideas in terms of what to do going forward. All right, so what is a literature review not, or what typically they don't do? They're not typically, the ones that are not effective are the ones that are just kind of like a collection of articles or a list of different articles. They're not really a collection of theories and sort of a mishmash of all these different theories. And they're not really a collection of some sort of proposition or past findings. I see, and this is the mistake that I was doing for a long time, I would give sort of this collection of all these past findings. And it took me years to sort of figure out what that means or what I was doing and what the problem was with what I was doing. And really what you're trying to do with a literature review is tell a story. And that's a key thing. Every single scientific article is telling a story about something. If you the more that you read in this area and the more that you do stuff, the more that you will see that every article is just telling a story about something or how the actually world, or how somebody believes that the world works, or maybe it's a few people believe that the world works. And that's really what you're trying to do with a literature review, is give an overview of what people have thought in the past of how the world works, or up to the current sort of literature of how the world works. And what you're trying to do is, part of it is identifying this sort of research gap thing, right? Where you're looking at some particular phenomenon and you're trying to come up with some sort of research gap. But really what you're trying to do is sort of lightly poke holes in terms of the pros and cons, or, strengths and weaknesses of previous mechanisms, or how we currently think that the world works, right? So it's a really important thing with any sort of scientific article or scientific endeavor. We're always sort of thinking about, well, this is a really nice way of doing it, but there's all these kind of weaknesses with the ways that you're doing it. So how do you typically organize a PhD literature review or some sort of literature review that you're working on? So generally what you should be doing, and it took me years again to figure this out. I was so just like, just like you, I'm learning with this entire process, and I just want to help you out. So the first thing is the first several sections that you're working on should be an overview of the dependent variable or the construct of the thing that you're working at. So dependent variable is, I know it's kind of, some people don't like that terminology, but just really the thing that you're focused on, that you're looking at, right? And, the sort of main thing that you're looking at. So if you're looking at childhood obesity, well, you want to look at, the current literature and write about the current literature in childhood obesity. But it's not only that specific thing that you're looking at, but it's maybe a specific sort of component of that. Maybe it's insulin levels in children, right? So what are the insulin levels, and how did insulin levels sort of change over the course of several decades and stuff like that. So you want to be really specific on the thing that you're working on, and that is where you're going to be sort of grappling with for a long time. It takes several months to several years to sort of figure out what the thing that you're looking at is, that you're working with. And it's like that for everybody. It's like that for every article that I ever worked on. And as you get more, so there's iterations that you go through, right? So, and you might craft an article, and you might craft the thesis, and then you send it to somebody, and then they're going to say, you know what, this is just not working in X, Y, and Z components. Well, then you kind of come back and sort of think about, well, what is the thing that you're looking at? What is the real phenomenon that you're looking at? So you're constantly revising and thinking about the phenomenon. And so it's going to change, and you're going to get a better understanding, because it's not going to be just childhood obesity. That's maybe not like this specific thing that you're really interested in, but it might be something really, really fine tuned. Maybe it's some sort of, the insulin level, but not only that, but maybe it's some sort of protein that is affecting the insulin level in kids. And that's what you're really looking at. You're really digging down into what you're trying to look at. And that's what we're trying to do with this process. And, it's never ending in terms of trying to do this discovery process. So eventually you kind of sort of have to nail down on what you're trying to focus on. But really what you're trying to do is, just have a clear understanding of what you're trying to do. So that's why it's really important to focus on the dependent variables, because it tells a story, or the thing that you're looking at tells a story that is really clear, and it helps other people sort of get a picture of what you're trying to do. It very much helps you out. And every time that I start a paper, I just start thinking about, okay, what is the thing that I'm looking at? And, it does change, but really you're trying to focus on that particular phenomenon, that dependent variable, that thing, that one little tiny thing, and trying to explain what's going on. And then what you're trying to do after that is you want to drive or create a case for looking at some sort of independent variable, or something that is going to affect that dependent variable in some sort of way, right? So you're looking at, okay, so there's this, insulin levels or some protein. I don't know, I'm just making this stuff up in all of us, and it sort of changes and affects the insulin level in children, especially children. So what might be causing that, or what might be leading to that, might be, changes in I don't know, appetite suppression or something. I don't know, I'm just making this up, right? So some other thing that is really important. So it might be, it might be some particular thing over here, and you have to sort of explain that. So the first thing is you want to explain the dependent variable and sort of go into depth about what that is. Then you want to explain the independent variable and go into depth of what that is. So maybe it is, this appetite suppression, or, maybe it's cognition, for example, that some kids, or, that they have some special sort of component of thinking, I don't know what it is, that can affect, protein levels. Is totally making this up. So whatever that is, then you have to explain this sort of component of cognition, right? So maybe they have abilities to withstand not eating for a while, right? So that component, I don't know. So then you have to explain what that is, and then you have to make a case or identify the relationship between this sort of component over here and how it might sort of lead to what's going on here. And you're telling the story of how we understand this working, right? And what's the sort of mechanism of how that might work. And so what you're trying to do when you're doing this is there might be several mechanisms that might have been identified in the literature. When you're doing that, then that's where the sort of different theories come into place, right? So we all have theories of how the world works. And there's generally multiple theories on how something might work. And then what you do is you go into the different theories about, okay, this mechanism is telling this and is based on this theory, or this theory suggests that there's this kind of mechanism here, and that mechanism is explaining this relationship, right? And it is it's got these strengths and these different weaknesses, or it holds under these conditions, or doesn't hold under those conditions. And that's what you're trying to do, is explain that relationship. So the way that you can tell the story, and there's kind of different techniques that I've seen, there's probably a lot more than what I've just, this was just quickly jotting down some of these notes. The way that you could tell a story is through a chronology of events, right? So you identify the dependent variable, the independent variable, and then you might tell the story of how the literature has changed over the course of the last 50 years. So early on, we thought it was this particular mechanism. Later on, we thought it was this particular mechanism. And now we think it's this kind of mechanism. And then you can come back and say, oh, but maybe we neglected something in the first mechanism, or when we initially started thinking about that. I've seen that kind of layout. I've also seen the layout of different strengths and weaknesses of the different existing mechanisms that we have. And so the one that is really strong, we sort of show that there is this relationship, it's really strong, and there's all this evidence. However, there's these weaknesses that currently we can't explain with this particular phenomenon. And it's very difficult to explain the world or this particular event or this phenomenon based on this theory that we have. And so what you could see, what we're trying to do is tell a story, right? So it's always telling a story, coming back to that, and thinking about how you would tell a story if you were in, I don't know, grade 9, or freshman, high school freshman, in high school, where you're sort of telling the English, or you're using your English skills in terms of writing to tell this particular story. And it's pretty universal as far as I've seen, and I've read pretty broadly, that this is how you sort of come up with a story in terms of, across the disciplines and stuff. The other one is, identification. So you can also identify sort of moments of uncertainty or unclarity with how the mechanism works. And that's coming back to, okay, we have this very strong mechanism, but, we're just really unclear about how this actually works here. There's kind of a little bit of hand waving sort of component of it. And, these past scientists or these past articles have suggested this particular thing is unclear. And I'd like to investigate that, right? And so that's one way that you can go into that, right? So you're just telling, again, you're trying to tell a story with, the relationship between whatever it is you focus on, dependent variable, and the independent variable that you would like to focus on, and come up with this relationship of why you actually think it exists and what are the current mechanisms that are there. So in terms of a normal structure of a literature review, normally, again, it's coming back to telling a section, or coming up with a section of the variable of interest, why it might be really important to investigate this thing. So childhood obesity, the rates of childhood obesity has been climbing, and we have all of these impacts on society. Maybe it's on healthcare costs, it's really expensive. And you can get into some of the literatures that sort of detail this kind of stuff, right? That is clearly what you want to do, and detail maybe it for each individual and each child that's under the age of 12, that for each one that is obese, then it's going to lead to, extra, I don't know, it's going to lead to government spending. So these scientific articles say that it's going to lead to X amount of spending in healthcare costs, right? So you're demonstrating a case for that. Or maybe you can demonstrate a case for, maybe you can tell something about mobility. It restricts mobility of children, which makes it less difficult, or makes it more difficult for them to run around, and it's more difficult for them to become, student athletes or something like that. Whatever it is, that's really, you're trying to tell a story and motivating why that thing that you're focused on is really important. And you're really just going into in-depth about that particular dependent variable. And you really do go into in-depth about that, all the different sort of components of why it's important, what exactly it is, and you got to define what it is pretty quickly, and then get into all the different literatures that sort of look at that particular thing, right? And that's where you can go into the different theories of how people are explaining that, and going into the different, what's going on behind the scenes. Now, the next thing is you can get into a section of sort of empirical findings, but don't go into that much, right? So you generally, it's not really effective to go into this article says this, and this article says this, and this article finds that. And that sort of listy kind of stuff, it's really ineffective in terms of demonstrating it. But you can go into and create different tables, for example, of, what are the different insights that people have about these different, what are these different findings and where they were unclear, for example, and getting, you're really just demonstrating a case and synthesizing the literature as best as you possibly can at that moment about the dependent variable. And then finally, you can get into, what people have investigated and why it's important with investigating maybe it's childhood obesity, for example, and why it's important to investigate that, but then detailing, okay, we haven't investigated this particular mechanism, which is the independent variable over here, right? So and then you come up to this research gap, and then you're identifying what is this research gap. So you say, well, everybody's investigated this, but then we haven't looked at this. But it's not only just that there's this research gap that people haven't looked at. It's really important that we actually look at this because it could explain all these other sort of things that are going on, right? So what you're ending with at the end, and then that's where you explain your independent variable and go into the different details with that, and the different mechanisms that you might have between the two independent variable and the dependent variable. And then that's where you end. It's generally with some sort of question or puzzle that you're trying to look at, right? So it's like, okay, if we've identified this relationship, well, how does it actually work? We don't have a lot of evidence of how this actually works. And what I'm going to do, or what we're going to do in this literature or this article, is go into greater depth about that. So a literature review, so you can do an entire article about that and go into different propositions, for example, and those are kind of a proposition is not typically a hypothesis, but generally there's a little bit of fuzziness around that, but generally a proposition is something that is not testable. That you go and you just tell this thing, you come up with this sort of hypothesis, but it's not. You can't test it currently in its current form, and you're not expecting to do it. So you just tell this sort of proposition how you might think that the world actually might work, and then you don't sort of test it. And so you can actually create an entire article that is like a literature review like this, where you go into depth. And where you can create the article, it's really in creating all these different tables and synthesis of the previous literature. It's not just telling what the literature is, but actually so the literature review articles are actually going into in depth of creating a story in terms of where we are, what are the gaps we're missing, for example, what we haven't looked at. What are the different mechanisms that we currently have looked at, and trying to synthesize all this kind of stuff and make it sort of readable and coherent as much as you can. So that's where things like tables, graphs, for example, maybe you'd look at trending over time. We've been looking at these different mechanisms going this way. And you'd look at maybe the citation counts over time of people being interested in those kind of things under the different mechanisms. And that's really, you can do many different sort of ways to analyze that. And you're just trying to go into greater depth of what is currently said and trying to sort of explain how people are currently explaining what's going on, right? It's a lot more trickier. Sort of these literature review articles are really tricky. They're just tough to do. And so, depending on your discipline, they can be a little bit more tougher than others. And so just, it just requires a lot of work to keep working at that. So what is the typical length of a literature review? So it varies a lot in terms of your discipline and in terms of the article or where you're planning on submitting it. And it varies a lot depending on your style of writing and what you're trying to do. And so for an article, most scientific articles, it's going to be anywhere between 2 to 10 pages, somewhere around there, right? So you might be a little longer if you're doing a literature review article, but generally it's somewhere around 2 to 10 pages, and that's double spaced. And that's kind of, that's pretty much the norm. So 2 is you're jumping right into what you're trying to do. And the reason why you jump right into it is you've got a lot of analysis to do, for example, or your results are really interesting and curious, and lots of people might be interested in that. The 10 is kind of more typical. It's a little more lengthy. Generally, I would say, in the articles that I written and I've seen other people write, it's somewhere around like 5. And that's kind of a pretty good rough estimate, right? So you shouldn't aim for more than that. In your thesis, if you're doing a PhD thesis, you want to aim for a lot more in depth. And so it's going to be a little bit more fluffy in terms of the stuff you're writing. And so you're probably looking for anywhere, from 10 to 100 pages, depending on your discipline. It really depends on the norms of your field and your supervisor and your advisors and what they're thinking. So some people have like to jump into things really quickly, and they'll just say, oh, there's X, Y, and Z problems or X, Y, and Z literatures, let's jump into it. Other people want to do like a real overview, and they'll get into all the different sort of mechanisms and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be really in depth, and that's going to be like your 100-page kind of manuscript for your literature review. It's a pain, but definitely that's possible. I think mine was somewhere around 75, somewhere around there, 75 pages, which was a lot. And it was pretty lengthy, but at the same time, it did a pretty good overview of all the sort of different ways that we understand. At the time, I was looking at organizational learning, which is how you gain experience and how experience actually improves performance within a company. So anyways, hopefully this answers your question in terms of what is a literature review and how you might actually sort of develop a literature review. So I went through a lot of different things here, and so you might want to rewatch this in terms of what I'm trying to do. But basically, you want some sort of format, and you want it to be concise in terms of telling a story about the dependent variable, the thing that you're interested in, right? So don't get caught up in that kind of language, but the thing that you're interested in and the mechanism with something else, and why you want to look at that something else and why it might connect, and why the other mechanisms or how sort of different things that we understand about that dependent variable or that main construct, and why it doesn't necessarily, why it's not being explained currently, and what are the sort of shortfalls and weaknesses and why it's not being explained right now. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Try to be as helpful as I possibly can. All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.